What happens when family secrets surface? The heartbreaking truth will stun you. Welcome to Stories TH. In today's video, we dive into a heartwarming story of love, family, and redemption. If you enjoy stories that touch your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more. Your support means the world to us. The painful beginning. Jake Harper, a 42-year-old clinical psychologist in New York, once lived a life full of joy and promise. His family was his anchor. His wife, Caroline, a compassionate and beautiful woman who shared his dreams and passions, was the love of his life. Together, they built a life filled with hope, love, and the warm embrace of their 15-year-old son, Ethan. But life, as it often does, has a way of turning happiness into sorrow, and it was in the blink of an eye that everything changed. The tragedy struck on a cold winter evening when Caroline, while returning from work, was involved in a devastating car accident. The collision left her with fatal injuries, and she was gone, taken from Jake and Ethan in an instant. The man who once prided himself on being a strong, steady presence for his family found himself shattered both emotionally and mentally. The death of Caroline plunged Jake into a deep abyss of grief and guilt, one that neither his profession nor his years of studying the human mind could help him navigate. He had spent years helping others confront their emotional trauma, but nothing prepared him for the weight of his own loss. The emotional scar left by Caroline's death was a constant, a painful reminder that life could be taken away at any moment. The pain was not just personal. It also ruptured his relationship with Ethan. The once close father and son now felt like strangers. Jake, paralyzed by grief and guilt, found himself retreating further into his own sadness, unable to connect with the son he had promised to protect and guide. Ethan, just on the cusp of adolescence, was devastated by the loss of his mother and felt abandoned by his father, who had become distant and emotionally unavailable. For Jake, every interaction with Ethan was a reminder of his failure. He had not only lost the love of his life, but he felt as though he was losing his son too. The weight of his past choices, both the ones made before the accident and the ones made after, began to consume him. He felt an overwhelming guilt for not being the father Ethan needed in the aftermath of Caroline's death. Worse, Jake feared he was losing the very thing he had fought so hard to protect, his family. The once vibrant home now felt hollow, like a ghost of the life it used to be. Ethan's behavior began to reflect the distance that had grown between them. He withdrew into himself, focusing more on his studies and avoiding his father's gaze. The boy who had once sought comfort in his father's arms now barely spoke to him, a silent protest against the father who was too consumed by his own grief to see his pain. In this broken state, Jake was forced to confront the consequences of his emotional withdrawal. As a clinical psychologist, he had helped countless people navigate their mental health struggles, but none of his training or experience seemed to offer solace for his own family's collapse. For the first time in his career, Jake felt completely powerless. The story begins at a critical juncture in their lives. Jake realizes he can no longer keep avoiding the deep rift between him and Ethan. The guilt, the grief, and the emotional disconnection had already destroyed so much of their relationship. But Jake's profession as a psychologist was about to give him the tools he needed to repair it, or so he hoped. Jake's journey of healing would require him to take an honest look at his own pain and emotional baggage. It would demand that he face not only his guilt over Caroline's death, but also the mistakes he made in the way he handled his relationship with Ethan. He couldn't undo the past, but he had to find a way to move forward, and most importantly, to rebuild the bond he had with his son. The transition from father and son to strangers in the same home was painful and heartbreaking. Yet, it was in this grief-stricken state that Jake knew he had to fight to reclaim his family. The task ahead was monumental. He had to rediscover the father he used to be, and Ethan needed to rediscover the trust he once had in his dad. For the first time in months, Jake found himself sitting across from Ethan at the kitchen table, a place that had once been filled with warmth and laughter, now cold and silent. As they both silently sipped their coffee, neither of them daring to say a word, Jake realized how much he had missed this, how much he missed them. The void left by Caroline was undeniable, but it was not just grief that kept them apart. It was the distance Jake had created in his attempt to shield himself from further emotional pain. The first step toward healing would not come easily, but Jake knew that if there was any chance of restoring their broken family, it would require vulnerability, a willingness to confront the painful emotions both he and Ethan had buried for so long. Jake would have to let go of the guilt he carried and forgive himself for the mistakes he believed had torn his family apart. As Jake stared at the empty space where Caroline used to sit, he realized that her absence would always be felt, but it didn't have to define their future. It was time for him to stop being a victim of the past and start being the father Ethan needed him to be. The heavy burden of his grief was not something he could carry alone, but it also wasn't something he could shield Ethan from. If Jake could learn to confront his own demons, perhaps he could help Ethan face his. Together, they would embark on a journey that would test their patience, their love, and their willingness to forgive. This was only the beginning of their story, a painful beginning, but it was also the first step toward healing and redemption. Their journey would be filled with setbacks and struggles, but Jake was determined to fight for his son, for their family, and for the chance to rebuild what was broken. We see the deeply emotional journey of a man and his son, each dealing with grief in their own way. The loss of Caroline looms large, but so does the sense of responsibility Jake feels toward Ethan. The story doesn't just focus on their grief, but also on their desire to reconnect and rebuild their relationship despite the weight of their past. The path ahead will be difficult, but the potential for healing is within their reach. Ethan, the silent boy Ethan, now 15, had transformed into a quiet, withdrawn teenager who seemed to have shut the world out, especially his father. After the tragic loss of his mother, he became engulfed in grief and loneliness, unable to find comfort in the person he once trusted most, Jake, his father. His once vibrant world now felt empty, and Ethan's only escape was to retreat into the isolation of his own mind. At school, Ethan became an outsider, walking the hallways unnoticed. The friends who once made him laugh seemed distant, as though they no longer understood him. His attempts to blend in failed. Instead of participating in class activities, Ethan sat in silence, staring at his desk, unable to focus. He became a ghost in his own life. His mind was consumed with the pain of his mother's death, and no amount of normal teenage distractions could pull him away from the hurt. He tried to fill the void by reading books or sketching in his room, often creating art that seemed to echo the confusion and sadness that swirled inside him. Ethan's art became a lifeline. Every stroke of the pencil or brush allowed him to release emotions he couldn't express verbally. His drawings were dark, twisted, surreal, and sometimes frightening. Strange, faceless figures appeared, often surrounded by bleak landscapes, reflecting the emptiness he felt in his heart. In the absence of his mother's understanding, his art was the only thing that seemed to make sense, a way to channel his confusion and pain. But despite the relief it brought, his sketches never made the pain go away. Meanwhile, Jake was trying, desperately trying, to reach his son, but every effort seemed to fall short. He would knock on Ethan's door and stand there, unsure of what to say or do. The father who had once been strong and confident in guiding his son now felt lost. He had tried everything he knew to bring Ethan out of his shell, talking to him, giving him space, even suggesting therapy. But nothing worked. It was as though Ethan had put up an invisible wall, and no matter how hard Jake tried to break it down, it remained unyielding. Jake couldn't understand why his son had shut him out. They had always been close before Caroline's death. But now, Ethan barely acknowledged him, except for the occasional, cold response. Jake's guilt about the accident that had claimed Caroline's life gnawed at him constantly, and he felt as though he had failed both his wife and son. The weight of that guilt, combined with Ethan's rejection, made it harder for Jake to reach out. But he knew he couldn't give up. He needed to find a way to connect with Ethan, to rebuild the broken bond that once held them together. The two of them lived under the same roof, but they were strangers to each other. Ethan's rejection was more than just emotional, it was also physical. He withdrew to his room whenever possible, refusing to interact with his father. Jake, meanwhile, spent his days at work as a therapist, helping others with their problems, but unable to fix his own family's broken dynamics. The constant tension in the house made it impossible for either of them to heal. Ethan couldn't find solace in his father, and Jake couldn't understand his son's pain. The silence between them was deafening. Every day felt like an endless cycle of trying and failing, of reaching out only to be met with more distance. Ethan, with all his grief and hurt, just wanted to be left alone. The world, including his father, felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. For Ethan, the silence was suffocating. There were days when he wished he could just disappear. The idea of facing another day filled with awkward conversations and empty rooms was more than he could bear. But what made it worse was the knowledge that Jake was there, trying to help, and yet they were both trapped in their own prisons of grief. As much as Jake wanted to heal the rift between them, he wasn't sure how to begin. He was a man trained to understand emotions, to guide others through their darkest times, but when it came to his own family, he was lost. How could he help his son when he couldn't even help himself? And how could he be the father Ethan needed when Ethan didn't even want him around? Ethan's life outside the house seemed just as empty. He didn't enjoy the same things he used to. His passion for soccer had faded, and his interest in hanging out with friends had vanished. His thoughts were consumed with his mother, and his inability to share his pain with anyone made it even harder. Every day felt like a struggle, and the weight of it all pushed him further into isolation. But despite the growing distance, there were small, fleeting moments when Ethan's guard would slip. Occasionally, he would glance at his father during breakfast or catch his eyes when Jake tried to initiate a conversation. For a split second, there was a flicker of the old Ethan, the boy who loved to joke around with Jake, who shared his hopes and dreams with Caroline. But these moments were short-lived, and the wall would go back up. Jake, meanwhile, found himself looking at old photographs of the family, desperately trying to hold on to the past. He would linger over pictures of Caroline, remembering her laugh, the way she had always been the glue that held them together. But the more he looked at those photos, the more he felt the sharp sting of loss, knowing that the family he had once known was gone. Jake's frustration grew with every passing day. He knew that the only way to help Ethan was to break through the barrier of silence, to find a way to communicate with him again. But how could he do that when everything he tried only seemed to push his son further away? It seemed as though they were stuck in a never-ending cycle of rejection and longing. Ethan needed his father, but he couldn't bring himself to open up. Jake needed his son, but he didn't know how to reach him. And so, they continued living together, side by side, but worlds apart. The silence in the house grew louder each day, a constant reminder of the love that once was and the pain that lingered in its wake. It was clear that both Ethan and Jake were lost in their own ways, but neither knew how to find the other. The only thing that was certain was that something had to change before they both lost each other completely. Jake realizes his mistakes. Context. As Jake sits alone in his office one evening, the weight of the past few years begins to settle heavily on his shoulders. He has spent countless hours working late, helping others through their emotional turmoil as a psychologist, but all the while his own son, Ethan, has been silently suffering in the next room. Jake had been so focused on keeping his professional life in balance and maintaining some semblance of normality in their shattered world that he had neglected the most important relationship of all, the one with his son. In the early days after Caroline's death, Jake was overwhelmed by the grief of losing his wife, the woman he loved deeply. The overwhelming shock left him numb, unable to process his feelings. He thought that by keeping busy, focusing on work, and maintaining a stable environment for Ethan, he was doing what was best for both of them. But as time passed, he realized that his attempts to stabilize their lives were futile if he neglected the emotional connection he had with his son. One evening, Jake found himself reflecting on how much time had passed without a real conversation between him and Ethan. The distance between them had grown so vast that it seemed almost impossible to bridge. Jake realized that, in his own pain, he had failed to recognize Ethan's silent suffering. He had been so lost in his own grief that he hadn't noticed how much Ethan had withdrawn from him. The boy had become a stranger in his own home, and Jake hadn't made any effort to reconnect with him. Jake's mind wandered back to the moments when Ethan was younger, the way he would rush home from school to tell his father about his day, how they used to share laughter over dinner, the closeness they once had. Now, all of that seemed distant, as though it belonged to another life, another time. But that wasn't the only thing Jake had ignored. He had failed to recognize Ethan's need for comfort and support, even as his son had silently cried out for it. Jake had not asked Ethan how he was feeling. He had not offered words of encouragement or shown vulnerability, and in doing so, he had inadvertently told his son that his grief did not matter. The turning point. Jake knew he could not continue to ignore the gaping hole in their relationship. Ethan was 15 years old, and in these crucial years, the way a father reacts to his son's emotions can shape the rest of their lives. Jake knew that if he did not act now, the rift between them would only continue to widen. One afternoon, after yet another silent dinner where Ethan had retreated to his room without so much as a word, Jake decided he had to make a change. He realized he couldn't simply wait for things to get better on their own. If there was any hope of healing the relationship, it would start with him taking the first step. Jake began by sitting in Ethan's room, in the space that had become a sanctuary for his son, a place of escape from the sadness of their home. At first, it was awkward. Ethan was clearly uncomfortable with his father being there. His walls, built from years of emotional isolation, were high and thick. But Jake didn't push him to talk. Instead, he just sat there, letting the silence settle between them. He knew that this was the first step, simply showing Ethan that he was there, that he cared, and that he was willing to listen, no matter how long it took. The struggle to connect. At first, Ethan resisted. He barely acknowledged his father's presence, keeping his eyes focused on his books, his drawings, or his music. Every now and then, Jake would try to start a conversation, but his son would shut him down with a terse response or a long, uncomfortable silence. The coldness from Ethan was palpable. It was clear that the pain of losing his mother was still raw, and his anger towards Jake ran deeper than he could express. But Jake remained persistent. He tried not to take Ethan's rejection personally. Instead, he focused on being consistent. He began to take small steps, a simple question about Ethan's day, offering to take him out for a walk, or even just being present in the same space, without forcing anything. Slowly, Ethan began to lower his guard, but it was an incredibly slow process. He wasn't ready to forgive Jake, and Jake wasn't ready to ask for forgiveness. But they were both beginning to realize that the only way forward was to keep showing up, day after day, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. Jake knew that the healing process would be long and painful. He couldn't erase the past, and neither could Ethan. But Jake understood that this was the only way to rebuild their relationship. Through small moments of vulnerability, patience, and an open heart, he hoped to create an environment where Ethan could feel safe to express his pain, his confusion, and, eventually, his forgiveness. The struggles of fatherhood. Fatherhood was never supposed to be easy, but for Jake, it had become an overwhelming challenge that he hadn't anticipated. When Caroline was alive, they had been a team, co-parenting their son with love and mutual understanding. Now, Jake found himself alone, trying to play both roles, the provider and the emotional anchor. It was a burden he wasn't sure he could bear, but he knew that if he didn't try, he would lose the chance to truly heal with his son. The emotional toll on Jake was undeniable. Every day, he questioned whether his efforts would ever be enough. Would Ethan ever let go of his anger? Would he ever see his father as someone who cared, not just a stranger who happened to live under the same roof? Jake often found himself feeling defeated, but there was always that small voice in the back of his mind, reminding him that it was worth trying, even if it meant risking his own vulnerability. There were moments when Jake doubted himself. The isolation he felt as a father, the feeling that he had failed as both a husband and a father haunted him constantly. But slowly, very slowly, he started to see glimpses of change in Ethan. Sometimes it was just a small gesture, a slight nod in Jake's direction, or a brief look of acknowledgement, but it was progress. And that was enough for Jake to keep going, discovering hidden emotions. Context. As the days go by, Ethan finds himself slowly retreating more into his creative world. While his peers are out socializing, engaging in the typical teenage life, Ethan immerses himself in art and science, creating his own sanctuary where he can express what words cannot. The emotional weight of losing his mother, combined with the growing distance from his father, had caused Ethan to shut off much of the outside world. School was a struggle, and he kept his distance from his classmates, preferring the quiet solitude of his room. His only solace came in the form of his sketches and scientific essays, where his imagination could run wild, untethered from the suffocating sadness that surrounded him. Ethan's passion for art and science wasn't something new. It was something that had been buried deep within him for years, a secret that he'd never dared to share with anyone. His mother, Caroline, had always been the one to encourage his creative inclinations, but after her passing, that encouragement seemed to fade. Ethan feared that if he shared his dreams with his father, he would only be met with disappointment or indifference. Jake had always been the practical one, the rational one, who worked in a world of clear logic and reason. The thought of his son pursuing an artistic or scientific career felt foreign to Jake, someone who had spent his life studying human emotions rather than creative expression. Thus, Ethan kept his secret close to his chest, writing about his dreams of becoming a painter or a researcher in the margins of notebooks and sketchbooks, hoping that his art would one day be seen by someone who could understand it. These works were not just expressions of creativity. They were windows into Ethan's soul, capturing his pain, his hopes, and his desire for something more than the void that had enveloped him since his mother's death. The turning point. One rainy afternoon, Jake decided to clean Ethan's room while his son was away at school. The room had always been a mess cluttered with books, scattered papers, and half-finished drawings. As Jake sifted through the piles of paper, a series of sketches caught his attention. He hadn't expected to find anything of interest, but what he discovered made him pause. There, in the pages of his son's notebooks, were beautiful, intricate drawings, landscapes, portraits, and even abstract art that seemed to express a world of emotion and pain. Some of the images were stark, depicting desolate landscapes, while others were more hopeful, filled with vibrant colors and whimsical shapes. It was clear that Ethan had poured a lot of emotion into these works, emotions that Jake had never fully understood or recognized. The sketches were accompanied by a series of scientific essays, detailed and passionate, about everything from astronomy to biology. There was an undeniable depth to Ethan's interests, a longing for knowledge that surpassed mere curiosity. It was as though Ethan was trying to find a way to make sense of the world and his place in it, just as Jake had tried to do with his own grief. But unlike Jake, Ethan hadn't found a way to share his feelings with the world, not even with his father. Jake was struck by the realization that Ethan's world was more complex than he had ever known. He had always thought of his son as a quiet, withdrawn teenager, someone who was simply grieving and trying to find his place in the world. But now, Jake saw that Ethan's silence was not born out of rebellion or disinterest. It was the result of a deep internal struggle, a battle between his dreams and his fears. Jake couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. How many times had he dismissed Ethan's need for connection, assuming that his son just needed time to heal? How many opportunities had he missed to really get to know the person Ethan was becoming? The realization, Jake's heart swelled with a mixture of emotions, pride, regret, and awe. He saw the potential in Ethan that had been hidden beneath layers of pain and silence. Ethan wasn't just the quiet boy who had withdrawn into his room. He was a young artist and scientist, someone with incredible talent and a unique perspective on the world. Jake realized that he had completely underestimated his son, both as a person and as a creative individual. The passion Ethan had for his art and his scientific curiosity were a reflection of the depth of his character, but Jake had never taken the time to recognize it. It became clear to Jake that his relationship with Ethan wasn't just about repairing broken communication or fixing emotional scars. It was also about acknowledging who Ethan was and supporting him in pursuing his passions, no matter how unconventional they seemed to Jake. Jake understood now that his son didn't need a father who tried to fix everything. He needed a father who would accept him for who he was, someone who would encourage him to chase his dreams, even if those dreams didn't align with Jake's own expectations or understanding of the world. The change in Jake. This discovery marked the beginning of a shift in Jake's approach. He no longer saw Ethan as a mere reflection of his own grief, but as an individual with his own desires, fears, and dreams. Jake began to recognize that he was not just a father, but also a mentor and a supporter. He didn't have to understand every detail of Ethan's artistic and scientific pursuits, but he had to be there to encourage and guide him. That evening, after Ethan returned from school, Jake took a deep breath and decided to share what he had discovered. Sitting down with his son, Jake showed him the drawings and essays. Ethan looked shocked, unsure of how his father had found them, but there was also a flicker of hope in his eyes. This was the first time Jake had ever really seen his son's true potential, the true Ethan, and he wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. "I had no idea," Jake said, his voice full of emotion. "These are incredible, Ethan. You've got so much talent. Why didn't you ever share this with me?" Ethan, still hesitant, shifted in his seat. "I didn't think you'd understand. You always seemed so focused on work, and I don't know. I didn't want to disappoint you." Jake felt a pang in his chest. "You could never disappoint me. I'm sorry for not being there for you. I see now that I've been too wrapped up in my own pain to see yours." For the first time in a long time, the walls between them began to crack. Ethan wasn't ready to fully open up, but Jake could see a small spark of something, maybe hope, maybe trust. It was a beginning. Moving forward, from that day forward, Jake made a commitment to support Ethan in every way he could. He encouraged Ethan to explore his creative side, to pursue his dreams without fear. Jake took an active role in his son's interests, asking questions about his art and his studies, showing genuine curiosity and admiration. Ethan, in turn, started to slowly open up, sharing more about his aspirations, his doubts, and his creative process. The relationship between them would never be perfect. There would always be scars from the past, and the journey to healing would be long. But this was a turning point. It was the moment when Jake realized that being a father wasn't just about providing or protecting. It was about seeing his son for who he truly was and supporting him in every way possible, no matter how different their worlds might be. Through this journey, they both began to discover new parts of themselves. For Ethan, the act of sharing his art and dreams with his father was a step toward healing. For Jake, it was a reminder that love and support often come in unexpected forms. This newfound understanding would help them both move forward together toward a better future. Finding hope again. Context. After several weeks in the hospital, Ethan's condition had stabilized somewhat, but the emotional toll it took on both him and Jake was far from over. Ethan had spent many nights in his sterile, lonely hospital room, the fluorescent lights flickering above as he wrestled with the reality of his diagnosis. The once joyful teenager who had poured his heart into art, music, and science now felt trapped in a world that seemed to be shrinking with each passing day. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled with weakness as he struggled to complete a simple sketch. The frustration was palpable, and Ethan often found himself retreating further into his mind, unable to cope with the changes happening to his body. Yet, despite everything, something had begun to shift. Over the past few weeks, Jake had worked hard to transform their relationship. He had listened more, talked more, and above all, tried to understand Ethan in ways he had not before. The father who had once been emotionally distant and disconnected had now become a more present, patient figure. This change was slow, incremental, but it was real. Jake's attempts to re-engage with his son were genuine, and Ethan, though hesitant at first, began to notice. Jake understood now that healing wasn't just about managing physical symptoms. It was about healing the emotional wounds that had been buried for so long. Ethan's world had been shattered by his illness, and Jake couldn't simply stand by and watch it happen. He had to be there for him emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. This was a battle that they would fight together, no longer alone. The turning point. One day, Jake decided to take a step further in bridging the gap between them. He had learned that Ethan, despite his illness, had never given up on his passion for art. Even in the sterile confines of his hospital room, Ethan had continued to draw, to sketch the world as he saw it, not the world of illness, but the world of beauty, color, and imagination. Jake had found one of Ethan's sketchbooks hidden beneath the bed during one of his late-night visits. He hadn't planned on looking through it, but something urged him to open the first page. What he saw took his breath away. The sketches were raw, vivid, full of emotion and light. They weren't just random doodles. They were windows into Ethan's soulless soul that had been hiding behind a mask of silence and pain for far too long. In that moment, Jake felt both immense pride and guilt. Pride for the incredible talent his son possessed, and guilt for not having seen it sooner, for not having been more attuned to Ethan's inner world. This discovery marked a turning point in their relationship. Jake realized that it was time to stop merely being a bystander in Ethan's life. It was time to support his son's dreams, even if it meant stepping out of his own comfort zone. So, Jake made a decision. He would take Ethan to see an art exhibition, something Ethan had once dreamed of attending, but never had the chance to. Jake was determined to show Ethan that his passion mattered, that it was something worth fighting for, even in the face of illness. The day of the exhibition arrived, and Jake could see a noticeable change in Ethan's demeanor. The thought of seeing his art displayed in a gallery, surrounded by beautiful pieces from other artists, filled him with both excitement and anxiety. Ethan had always been reserved about his work, reluctant to share it with others. But today he was ready. As the two of them walked through the exhibition, Jake couldn't help but feel a profound sense of awe. Ethan's work was truly exceptional, full of light, depth, and emotion. His pieces were a reflection of everything Ethan had been through, yet they were also a symbol of hope, of resilience. There was one painting in particular that caught Jake's eye. It was a large canvas filled with vibrant colors and sweeping brushstrokes. The painting depicted a scene of a vast, open sky, dotted with clouds, with a single bird soaring high above the landscape. It was powerful, serene, and yet, somehow, incredibly hopeful. As they stood in front of it, Jake could feel the weight of Ethan's emotions pouring out of the painting. This wasn't just art. This was Ethan's way of telling the world that, despite everything, he still believed in the possibility of freedom and the possibility of hope. And in that moment, something remarkable happened. Ethan, for the first time in what felt like forever, felt truly seen. He wasn't just a sick boy in a hospital bed anymore. He was an artist. He was someone whose work had value, whose voice mattered. The tears in his eyes weren't just from the overwhelming emotions of the day. They were tears of recognition, of acknowledgement. Jake, standing beside him, finally understood. He had always loved Ethan, but now he truly saw him not just as his son, but as an individual with dreams, passions, and a future that was still worth fighting for. A moment of connection. As they stood there, side by side, looking at Ethan's artwork, Jake placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. Ethan turned to him, his eyes filled with emotion. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Words seemed unnecessary, for they both understood the gravity of the moment. Jake's pride in his son was palpable, and Ethan's gratitude was overwhelming. "I've never shown anyone my work like this," Ethan said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "You're amazing, Ethan," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I've always known you were special. I didn't see it. I'm sorry." Ethan looked at him, a flicker of something like hope sparking in his eyes. Maybe I can still do something with this, even with the disease. I don't want it to define me." Jake nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "And it won't. You're more than your illness, Ethan. You're my son, and you're an artist." For the first time in a long time, both father and son stood together, not as two people lost in their own pain, but as a family rediscovering each other. The gallery, once a place of unfamiliarity, became a place of healing. In the midst of their shared sorrow, they found a glimmer of hope, a hope that, no matter what came next, they could face it together. A new beginning, From that day forward, things began to change between them. Jake continued to encourage Ethan's art, taking him to more exhibitions, introducing him to other artists, and helping him navigate the complex world of art as a potential career. It wasn't an easy road, but the sense of shared purpose, of mutual understanding, brought them closer. They began to talk more, to laugh more, to share not only their pain, but also their dreams. Ethan's condition remained a challenge, but it no longer defined him. He found solace in his art, and slowly, the disease that had once seemed all-consuming became just another part of his story, not the whole of it. Jake, too, began to heal. The guilt he had carried for so long started to fade, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude for the relationship he had with his son. As the weeks turned into months, and Ethan's condition remained stable, Jake realized that the hope they had found wasn't just about surviving the disease. It was about living, truly living even in the face of uncertainty. And together, father and son learned to find hope again, not just in the art that filled their lives, but in the love that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. Moments of sharing. Context. It had been months since the emotional distance between Jake and Ethan had started to close, but the journey wasn't easy. After so many silent nights and awkward interactions, there had been a shift. It wasn't just the hospital visits or the exhibitions that helped them reconnect. It was the small, quiet moments, the ones that felt like cracks in a wall that had been built too high for far too long. Jake, once a man of few words, had begun to open up in ways he never had before. He had learned the importance of vulnerability, the power of sharing emotions, and the truth that communication wasn't just about words, it was about listening, truly listening, and feeling the weight of what wasn't said. For Ethan, the change was monumental. He had spent years with a quiet, deep-seated anger that stemmed from a sense of abandonment. His father had never understood his world, his pain, his dreams. But now, something was different. They were finally starting to speak the same language. It wasn't always easy for Ethan to let his guard down, but he had learned that his father was finally willing to listen without judgment, without rushing to fix things, but just to be there. And that made all the difference. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Jake reading a book, Ethan sketching in his notebook, they found themselves talking. It was as if the floodgates had been opened. The conversation started small, with Jake asking Ethan how he was feeling. But soon, it evolved into something deeper, something real. Jake, who had spent so many years hiding his emotions beneath layers of responsibility and guilt, shared the struggles he had faced since Caroline's death. He spoke of his loneliness, his grief, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness he felt in trying to raise Ethan alone. The words came hesitantly at first, but once spoken, they didn't stop. It felt freeing to let out what had been held inside for so long. For Jake, this moment was a revelation. He had spent so many years thinking that being strong meant being silent, that showing emotion was a sign of weakness. But in sharing his pain, he found a kind of strength he hadn't known he had. Ethan, too, began to speak. He told his father about the anger and confusion he had been feeling, about how he had always felt like he was invisible to Jake. He spoke about his fear of being forgotten, of being seen as nothing more than a burden, a reminder of the life they had lost. It was raw and painful for both of them, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter. The more they talked, the more they realized that they had been living in parallel worlds for so long. Jake had been trying to protect Ethan, but in doing so, he had isolated him. Ethan had been hiding his true self, afraid that his father would never understand his passions or his pain. But now, they were finding common ground, both of them realizing that they were not so different after all. Both of them had suffered, both of them had lost, but neither of them had given up. The turning point. As they continued talking that night, the subject shifted to the future. Ethan, who had always kept his dreams close to his chest, began to open up about his aspirations. He confessed that he wanted to be an artist, something that had always felt like a distant dream, something that seemed impossible given the circumstances. But he also shared something more profound, something that Jake had never known, the memory of his mother's encouragement. "I remember, Mom always said that I had to live a life that mattered," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. She always told me to follow my heart, to find something that made me feel alive. I think, I found it in art. I want to keep doing it, even if I'm sick, even if it's hard. It's the only thing that makes sense to me." Jake's heart swelled with emotion as he listened. Ethan had been carrying this weight, this secret hope alone for so long. And now it was out in the open. Jake felt a profound sense of pride in his son, mixed with a deep sense of sadness. He knew that Ethan's journey was going to be difficult, that there would be obstacles and hardships ahead. But he also knew that Ethan was stronger than he had realized. The strength Ethan had shown through his art, through his ability to dream despite everything, was something Jake could no longer ignore. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea how much you were carrying, and I'm sorry for not being there before. But I'm here now. I'm going to support you, no matter what. You're not alone in this. I promise." For the first time, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't just the promise of support, it was the recognition of his dreams, of his aspirations. He had always feared that pursuing art would make him seem weak, that it would be dismissed as an impossible fantasy. But here, with his father, those fears melted away. He realized that he didn't need to choose between his illness and his dreams. He didn't have to let his disease define him. He could be more than his diagnosis. He could be an artist, a person with purpose, a new understanding. Over the following weeks, their relationship continued to deepen. They began to spend more time together, Jake, once again, taking an active role in Ethan's life. They talked about art, about the future, about Caroline, and about the things that truly mattered. They laughed together, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes easily, but always with a sense of shared understanding. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Ethan turned to Jake, a new resolve in his eyes. "I've been thinking," he said, "maybe I could start working on a project. I want to make something that tells people how I feel. Not just with words, but with pictures. I want to share my story, share my heart." Jake nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "You should," he said. "I think people would want to hear it. I think people will be moved by it." In that moment, Jake realized that this was the start of something beautiful. Their bond was stronger than ever before, and it was based on something far more powerful than shared grief. It was based on shared dreams. For the first time in a long time, they both had hope. Hope for the future, for their relationship, and for the possibility that, no matter what happened, they could face it together. A promise of support. As the weeks turned into months, Jake became Ethan's biggest supporter. He didn't just sit back and watch, he became actively involved in Ethan's art, helping him set up a space where he could work freely. He reached out to local galleries, encouraging Ethan to showcase his work. He attended art classes with him, learning more about what made Ethan's art unique. They even began to plan an exhibition, one that would showcase not just Ethan's work, but his story, his journey, his struggles, and his dreams. Jake's commitment to supporting Ethan went beyond just words. It became an active, daily promise to be there for him, no matter what. And Ethan, for the first time, felt like he could truly embrace his dreams, knowing that he wasn't alone, knowing that his father, the person who had once been so distant, was now his strongest ally. The journey ahead would not be easy, but together, they could face whatever came next. And for Ethan, that was the most important thing of all. The return of the past. Context: Jake had carried the weight of his guilt for so long, a constant, suffocating presence in the back of his mind. The death of Caroline, his wife, had left a wound so deep, so unhealable, that he had never truly allowed himself to move forward. There were days when the memories of their life together were too much to bear, and other days when he felt utterly numb, as if everything was just a blur. But despite his suffering, Jake knew that he could never undo the past. The choices, the words left unsaid, the moments lost in time, they were all beyond his control. What he could control, however, was the present and the future he was now determined to build for his son, Ethan. For years, Jake had avoided going back to the place where Caroline had died. It was too painful, too raw. But now, as he looked at the life they had built together, the thought of leaving things unresolved gnawed at him. He knew that he needed closure, that he needed to face his past in order to truly embrace the future. He needed to make peace with Caroline's memory, not just for his own sake, but for Ethan's as well. After much contemplation, Jake decided to take a trip to the small, quiet area on the outskirts of New York where Caroline had spent her final moments. The place was peaceful rolling hills, dense forests, and a serene lake surrounded by willow trees. It was a stark contrast to the chaos of his life since her passing. It was here, in this tranquil spot, that they had both once dreamed of building a life together, far away from the noise of the city. But now, as Jake stood in the same spot, it felt like he was standing on the edge of both a past he couldn't escape and a future he had yet to shape. The moment of realization, Jake arrived at the cemetery where Caroline was buried, a quiet and somber place that felt strangely untouched by time. The air was thick with the weight of memories, and as Jake walked among the gravestones, he couldn't help but feel the profound emptiness of the moment. The absence of her was almost unbearable. He stopped in front of Caroline's grave and knelt down, his hand trembling as he placed a single flower on the ground. He had been here before, but today felt different. Today, there was no bitterness, no anger, only an overwhelming sense of loss. And, unexpectedly, a quiet but certain realization. He could never change what had happened, but he had the power to change what was to come. Jake had spent so many years in the shadow of his guilt, carrying the burden of believing that somehow he had failed Caroline, that he had failed to protect her, to cherish her the way she deserved. But here, in the quiet presence of her grave, he realized something crucial. Holding on to that guilt, letting it define him, only kept him from moving forward. Caroline wouldn't have wanted that for him. She had always believed in living fully, in moving forward, even after pain. And so, for the first time, Jake allowed himself to forgive himself. He allowed himself to release the burden of guilt that had been hanging over him for so long. As he stood up, a sense of peace began to wash over him. It was as if the past, the darkness that had weighed so heavily on his soul, had finally been released. He could breathe again. He could move forward. The promise. Jake stood there, looking down at Caroline's gravestone, and for the first time in years, he felt her presence, not in the way he had imagined in his grief, but in a way that felt like a blessing. He wasn't alone. He was never truly alone. Caroline had always believed in him, and she had always believed in the future they could have built. He realized that he had to live that future, not for her memory alone, but for himself and for Ethan. Taking a deep breath, Jake spoke the words he had never been able to say aloud before. "I'm sorry, Caroline. I couldn't protect you the way I should have. But I promise you this, I will always take care of Ethan. I will be there for him, always. And I'll make sure he knows how much you loved him, how much we both loved him." The words felt like a release, a commitment. Jake could finally let go of the guilt and the anger that had held him hostage for so long. In that moment, he knew that he was no longer the man who had been lost in grief. He was the man who was ready to embrace the future, to build the life he had once dreamed of with Caroline. But this time, it would be with Ethan by his side. A new beginning. As Jake made his way back to the car, he felt a strange lightness in his chest, as though a weight had been lifted from his heart. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope for the future. He knew there would still be challenges ahead. Ethan's illness was still a heavy burden, and there were so many uncertainties in their lives. But Jake also knew that they were no longer alone. They had each other. On the drive home, Jake found himself thinking about the future in a new light. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of what was to come. He wasn't afraid of facing the unknown. He had finally made peace with the past, and now, with Ethan by his side, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He knew that the road wouldn't always be easy, but he was determined to walk it with his son. That night, when he returned home, Jake sat down with Ethan, who had been anxiously waiting for his return. The two of them sat together, the silence between them now more comfortable than it had ever been. Ethan looked up at his father, his eyes filled with questions. Jake, with a new sense of peace and purpose, smiled at his son. "Ethan," he said, his voice steady and full of love, "I'm sorry it took me so long to get here. But I want you to know, from now on, I'm going to be the father you need me to be. I'm going to be here for you, always." Ethan's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something that had been missing for so long: hope. He reached out and took his father's hand. "I know, Dad," he whispered. "I know." And just like that, with the promise of a future where they would face their struggles together, Jake and Ethan's relationship was forever changed. The past would always be a part of them, but it no longer defined them. What mattered now was the future they would build together. And for the first time in years, Jake felt that, no matter what, they would be okay. Compassion and forgiveness. Context. As the weeks passed, Ethan's battle with his illness continued, but it was no longer just his health that consumed his thoughts. There was a deeper transformation happening within him, one that extended beyond his physical pain. In the quiet moments of reflection during his hospital stays, Ethan found himself grappling with the emotional scars of his past. His relationship with Jake had always been strained, tainted by years of silence, grief, and miscommunication. But as he watched his father struggle with his own regrets and slowly open up, Ethan began to realize something profound. Healing wasn't just about getting better physically, it was also about letting go of the past, forgiving those who had hurt you, and finding peace within yourself. Ethan had always held onto the memory of his mother, Caroline. Her death had left a void in his heart, a sense of abandonment that no one could fill. For a long time, he had blamed the world for taking her away from him. He had blamed Jake for not being there when he needed him the most. But as time went on, Ethan began to understand that holding on to this anger only fueled his pain. He realized that it wasn't just his father who had been lost in grief. He himself had been clinging to his own bitterness, and it was preventing him from moving forward. Through his artwork, his writing, and the quiet moments spent with his father, Ethan began to discover a new sense of self. He had always wanted to be an artist, to capture the beauty and complexity of the world through his eyes. But there was a deeper layer to his passion for art. He saw it as a way to process his emotions, to work through the pain of his past, and to find healing. And as his bond with Jake grew stronger, Ethan realized that the key to moving forward wasn't just through his art, but through something even more powerful: compassion and forgiveness. The moment of realization. One evening, as Jake sat at Ethan's bedside, the two of them shared a quiet moment. Jake, who had been so absorbed in caring for Ethan and dealing with his own emotions, was beginning to notice the subtle changes in his son. Ethan no longer seemed as withdrawn or bitter. There was something lighter in his demeanor, as if he had finally made peace with the past. Jake felt a deep sense of gratitude for the progress they had made, but he also knew that there was still a lingering tension between them, one that needed to be addressed. Ethan, sensing the moment, looked up at his father and spoke in a soft but steady voice. "Dad, I've been thinking about everything about Mom, about us, and I want you to know something." Jake turned to him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "What is it, Ethan?" he asked, his heart heavy with anticipation. "I've forgiven you," Ethan said, his words catching in the quiet room. It was as though the weight of those words had been building up for months, and now they were finally being set free. "I've forgiven you for everything, for not being there when I needed you, for not understanding me, for all the things we both let go unsaid." Jake's heart sank, and a wave of emotion hit him like a freight train. He had never expected those words to come from Ethan, and yet, as he heard them, he felt a profound sense of relief. For so long, he had carried the burden of guilt, thinking that he had failed as a father. But now, his son was offering him something far more precious than forgiveness. He was offering him a second chance. A chance to rebuild, to grow, and to love without the chains of the past weighing them down. Ethan continued, "I know it's hard. I know things will never be the same without Mom, but I don't want to keep living in the past. I want to live for today and for the future. I want us to be a family again, even if it's different from what we imagined." Jake's eyes welled with tears as he reached out to hold Ethan's hand. The connection between them, which had once been so fractured, now felt stronger than ever. Jake squeezed his son's hand tightly, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Ethan, I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I promise you, I will spend every day trying to be the father you need me to be. I'll be there for you always. The power of forgiveness. Ethan's words were more than just an expression of forgiveness. They were a testament to the strength that had emerged from the depths of his pain. Forgiveness, in its truest form, is not an easy thing to give. It requires vulnerability, courage, and a willingness to release the past in order to embrace a better future. And Ethan, despite everything he had been through, had found it within himself to offer that forgiveness not only to Jake, but also to himself. In the days that followed, the dynamic between father and son began to shift. They talked more openly, shared their thoughts and fears, and spent time doing things they both enjoyed. Jake would sit with Ethan while he worked on his art, offering encouragement and support. Ethan, in turn, would listen to his father's stories from the past, understanding for the first time the weight Jake had carried all these years. The healing process wasn't immediate. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the scars of the past resurfaced. But Ethan had learned that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, it was about choosing to move forward. It was about recognizing that holding on to anger and resentment only kept him stuck in a cycle of pain. And he didn't want to be stuck anymore. He wanted to live a life that honored both the memory of his mother and the future he was building with Jake. The new beginning. One evening, as the two of them sat together in the living room, Jake turned to Ethan with a soft smile. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking a lot about the future, about your art, about where we go from here." Ethan looked up from his sketch pad, his eyes curious. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean, I want to help you pursue your dream," Jake replied. "I don't know what it's going to look like, but I want to support you, Ethan. I've seen how much passion you have for it, and I want to make sure you never give up on it, no matter what." Ethan's eyes widened, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly seen. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "That means more to me than you know." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through settling into the space between them. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't seem as daunting. The future was no longer a source of fear or uncertainty. It was something they would face together, with hope, with compassion, and with the unbreakable bond of family. And in that moment, Ethan knew that no matter how hard the journey ahead might be, he was no longer alone. He had his father by his side, and together they could overcome anything. A new home. Context. The gentle rhythm of Ethan's recovery was the backdrop for an even more profound change, one that went beyond his physical health. After months of intense treatment and therapy, the doctors had finally given Ethan the good news. His condition was under control. The mysterious illness that had threatened to steal his future was now in the rearview mirror. But while his body was healing, it was his soul, his relationship with his father, and their life together that was still evolving. The road to emotional recovery had been long and filled with difficult conversations, emotional breakthroughs, and silent moments of reflection. But it was clear now that both father and son had started to heal piece by piece. Jake, having slowly come to terms with his past mistakes, was more focused than ever on rebuilding a future with his son. He had made a promise to Caroline before she passed that he would protect Ethan, and now that promise had taken on a deeper meaning. Jake was no longer just trying to keep Ethan alive. He was committed to helping his son truly live to pursue his dreams and build a life filled with purpose, peace, and love. The decision to move was a practical one at first. Ethan needed a fresh start, away from the reminders of his sickness, and Jake needed a place where they could both heal. They chose a small house near the coast, tucked away in a quiet town where the air was fresh and the sound of waves crashing on the shore could soothe even the most troubled of souls. The house was modest, nothing extravagant, but it was a blank slate for them, an opportunity to start over. As they packed their belongings and said goodbye to the sterile hospital rooms, there was a sense of optimism in the air. This move represented not just a change in their physical surroundings, but also a shift in their relationship, their outlook on life, and the bond they had started to repair. It was a new chapter, one that would be filled with challenges, of course, but also with the kind of quiet happiness that comes from having a place to call home and a family to share it with. The turning point. On their first morning in their new home, the air was crisp with the salt of the ocean, and the sun was just beginning to rise. Jake and Ethan stood at the edge of the porch, looking out over the sparkling blue waters that stretched to the horizon. There was something incredibly peaceful about the scene before them, something that felt like a promise, like a new beginning. Ethan could feel the weight of the past slowly lifting, replaced by a sense of calm and possibility. "Let's go for a walk," Jake suggested, his voice gentle but full of warmth. Ethan nodded, feeling the need to stretch his legs and breathe in the fresh sea air. Together, they walked down the quiet road that led to the beach, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the distant roar of the ocean. As they walked along the shoreline, the two of them fell into an easy silence, the kind that no longer felt uncomfortable but instead felt familiar, safe. Jake glanced over at his son, who was looking out at the waves, his expression thoughtful. He could tell that Ethan was deep in thought, but for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel the need to press him for answers. He had learned to let Ethan speak when he was ready after all. They were both still learning how to communicate with one another. It was Ethan who finally broke the silence, his voice soft but clear. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do with my life, Jake's heart swelled with pride at the sound of his son's voice, his tone filled with a newfound confidence. This was a side of Ethan he hadn't seen before. The boy who had once been too quiet, too withdrawn, was now speaking with clarity and determination. Jake gave him a reassuring smile. "What are you thinking, son?" Ethan paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I think I want to be an artist, or maybe a researcher. I'm not sure yet, but I know that I want to create something meaningful, something that can help people, or just make them see the world in a different way." He turned to Jake, his gaze steady. "I've been drawing since I was a kid, and even though things have been hard, I still love it. I can't imagine giving it up." Jake stopped walking and turned to face his son fully. The sunlight caught Ethan's face, casting a warm glow on his features. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. He had spent so many years trying to control everything around him, trying to fix what was broken, trying to keep his family together, trying to be the perfect father. But in this moment, he realized that the only thing he could truly do for Ethan was to support him, to let him choose his own path. "Whatever you decide to do, Ethan, I'll be here for you," Jake said, his voice steady, filled with an unwavering love that only a father could have for his child. "I believe in you, and I'll support you no matter what." Ethan's face lit up with a smile, one that reached his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like everything was right in the world. He had found his voice, and Jake had found the strength to listen. Together, they had come to a place of understanding, and for the first time in a long while, they were both able to see the future not as something to fear, but as something to embrace. The promise of a new beginning. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over the ocean, the two of them sat together on the porch, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt as if the world had slowed down just for them, allowing them to savor the simple joy of being together. The house, the beach, the new town, it all felt like the right place to be. A place where they could heal, grow, and discover what it meant to be a family again. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed as he listened to the sounds of the ocean. "I think we made the right choice, Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This feels right." Jake looked over at his son, his heart full. "It does, doesn't it?" he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of you, Ethan. You're strong, and you've come so far. I can't wait to see what you do with your life." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had come so far from the sick child lying in a hospital bed to the young man standing on the edge of the ocean, ready to step into his future. And while the road ahead would still have its challenges, Ethan knew one thing for certain. With his father by his side, he could face anything. "Thanks, Dad," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." And so, under the setting sun and with the waves crashing softly against the shore, they both knew that this was only the beginning, a new chapter for both father and son, filled with hope, love, and the promise of a brighter future. The house by the ocean wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of everything they had overcome and everything that was yet to come. It was home, a bright future. Context. As time passed, life slowly but steadily began to regain its balance. The months of turmoil, emotional strain, and medical uncertainty had eventually given way to a sense of calm, and both Jake and Ethan had found their footing in this new chapter. Jake, once riddled with the fears and regrets of the past, now faced each day with a renewed sense of purpose. He had learned not only to forgive himself, but also to let go of the pressure that had weighed him down for so long. The constant battle between guilt and love had finally settled, leaving space for something far more powerful: hope. In the quiet town by the ocean, Jake returned to his work with a sense of clarity that he hadn't known before. His career, which had once been a source of endless anxiety, now felt like a means to an end, a way to provide for Ethan, yes, but also a way to set an example of resilience, responsibility, and the pursuit of personal growth. The mistakes of his past no longer defined him. They were part of his story, but not the whole narrative. He was more than the sum of his failures. He was a father, a provider, and now a man who had learned to embrace the beauty of life's second chances. For Ethan, life was taking an entirely new direction. The young man who had once felt trapped by illness, isolation, and uncertainty was now standing on the cusp of a bright future. His illness no longer dominated his days. His creativity, once stifled by fear and doubt, was now flourishing in full bloom. The blank canvas of his life stretched out before him, filled with the potential to create and innovate, to inspire others, just as he had been inspired by the art that had sustained him through his darkest times. The news that Ethan had received a full scholarship to a prestigious art university felt almost surreal. It was a dream come true, not just for him, but for both father and son. Ethan had worked tirelessly to prove to himself and to the world that he had the talent, determination, and heart to succeed. And now, his hard work was paying off in ways neither he nor Jake had ever imagined. The scholarship was not just a recognition of Ethan's artistic talent, but a symbol of the incredible journey they had both embarked on together, a journey that had tested their limits and strengthened their bond beyond measure. The turning point, the day Ethan received his acceptance letter and scholarship offer, was one of those rare moments when everything seemed to align perfectly. It was a bright and sunny afternoon, and the excitement in the air was palpable. Jake and Ethan sat side by side in their new living room, the ocean breeze flowing through the open windows. The letter was in Ethan's hands, and Jake could see the tremor of disbelief in his son's eyes. He knew this was a moment of immense significance, one that neither of them would ever forget. Ethan glanced up from the letter, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and joy. I did it, Dad. I got in. They're offering me a full scholarship." The words felt almost surreal as they escaped his lips. Jake felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched his son process the news. The room felt too small for all the emotions swirling inside of him, but there was no denying the pride that surged within him. "That's amazing, Ethan," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew you could do it. I always knew." He reached out, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. A simple gesture, but one that carried all the love and support he had been offering for years. "You've worked so hard for this. You deserve it." Ethan smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. You were always there for me, even when I didn't believe in myself. I never felt alone with you by my side. You've taught me so much, not just about art, but about life. You've shown me how to be strong, how to push through when everything feels like it's falling apart." Jake's heart swelled with emotion. These were the words he had longed to hear, the words that made every sacrifice, every struggle, every sleepless night worth it. The sense of accomplishment that Ethan felt wasn't just about the scholarship. It was about everything they had been through together, everything they had overcome. And in that moment, Jake realized that his own journey had brought him to this place, to this beautiful, full-circle moment where he could finally feel that he had done something right. The years of pain, the loss, the fear, and the uncertainty had led to this moment of triumph. They had both fought for their relationship, fought for a better future, fought to heal old wounds. And now, they were standing at the threshold of a new life, one that held the promise of limitless possibilities. The moment of gratitude. As they sat together in the living room, the weight of the moment finally hit Ethan. He had dreamed of this day for so long, but now that it was here, it was hard to find the right words. He turned to his father, his voice low and sincere. "Dad," Ethan began, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I want to thank you. You've been my rock through everything. When Mom passed, I didn't know how I was going to survive. I didn't know if I could ever be happy again. But you never gave up on me. You always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. I wouldn't be here today, standing with this scholarship, without you." Jake felt the tears that had been building up behind his eyes finally fall. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pride, of relief, and of an overwhelming sense of love. He had spent so many years fearing that he wasn't enough, that he had failed as a father, but here was his son, telling him that he had done exactly what he was supposed to do. He had loved, he had supported, and he had never let go. "You don't have to thank me, Ethan," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm just doing what any father would do. I'm proud of you. So proud of the man you're becoming." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the words sink in. The house was quiet except for the sound of the ocean in the distance. It felt like the calm before the storm of change, the moment before everything shifted once again. But this time they were ready for it. The future unfolds. As the days passed, life in their new home continued to settle into a comfortable routine. Ethan began preparing for his new adventure, researching the university, talking to professors, and getting ready to leave for college. He still had moments of doubt, moments when the weight of the unknown seemed daunting. But with Jake by his side, he felt ready to take on whatever came next. The journey ahead was not going to be easy, but for the first time, Ethan felt that he was on the right path. For Jake, this was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when he could finally let go, knowing that Ethan was ready to fly. It was bittersweet, knowing that the days of raising his son were coming to an end, but it was also a moment of immense pride. He had helped shape Ethan into the young man he was becoming, and now it was time to step back and watch him soar. As Ethan packed his bags for university, Jake stood in the doorway, watching his son prepare for this next chapter of his life. It felt like a culmination of everything they had been through together, the long nights, the heartache, the triumphs. And now, the future was finally open before them, full of endless possibilities. "I'm going to miss you, Dad," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. Jake smiled, his heart full of love and pride. "I'll miss you too, son, but I know you're going to do amazing things. I believe in you." And with that, Ethan stepped into the future, ready to chase his dreams, knowing that no matter where life took him, his father would always be there, cheering him on from the sidelines. It was a bright future ahead, a future built on love, sacrifice, and the unwavering bond between a father and his son. Healing and success context. The journey that Jake and Ethan had taken was not an easy one. It had been fraught with pain, sorrow, self-doubt, and the kind of life-changing events that force you to reevaluate everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world around you. But in the end, after all the heartache and hardship, they had found something incredibly precious: peace. Ethan had come a long way since the early days of his illness. What once seemed like an insurmountable obstacle had now become a part of his past, no longer defining who he was or what he could achieve. His creativity had flourished, and he had found a purpose in life that brought him both fulfillment and joy. He was no longer the boy trapped by his diagnosis. He was an artist, a dreamer, and a young man determined to build his future. Jake, too, had experienced a profound transformation. For so long, he had carried the weight of guilt and regret on his shoulders, feeling as though he had failed both himself and his family. The loss of Caroline had been a wound that refused to heal, and his relationship with Ethan had suffered as a result. But through the process of healing, both emotionally and physically, Jake had come to understand that forgiveness both of others and of himself was the key to finding peace. In their new home by the ocean, a place where they could start fresh, Jake and Ethan had cultivated a life built on mutual understanding and unwavering support. The love that had once been overshadowed by grief and anger now flourished in their daily interactions. It was a love that had been tested, tried, and strengthened by the trials they had faced together. The turning point. One evening, as the golden hues of the setting sun filtered through the windows of their modest yet beautiful home, Jake and Ethan sat together at the dining table. It was a quiet evening, just the two of them, as they had so many times before, but this time there was something different in the air. The tension that had once hung over their meals, unspoken words, unresolved anger was gone. In its place was a deep sense of calm, a quiet assurance that they were exactly where they were meant to be. As they shared a simple meal, the familiar clinking of silverware and the hum of soft music in the background, Jake looked over at Ethan, his heart full of gratitude. They had come so far, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride for the young man his son had become. Ethan had surpassed every expectation, not just academically or artistically, but emotionally. He had learned to forgive, to heal, and to embrace the beauty of life even in the face of loss. Ethan, Jake began, his voice steady but full of emotion. I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've gone through so much, and yet you've come out stronger on the other side. You're not just an incredible artist. You're an incredible person, and I can't imagine a better son. Ethan looked up from his plate, his eyes softening as he met his father's gaze. I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. You were always there for me. You gave me strength when I didn't have any. You taught me how to live again, how to be myself. I'll never be able to thank you enough for that. Jake smiled, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within him. He had spent so many years fearing he wasn't good enough, that he couldn't be the father Ethan needed. But here they were, stronger, more connected, and more in love than ever before. Ethan was right. It wasn't just about the art or the scholarship or the accomplishments. It was about the relationship they had built, the bond they had formed, and the unwavering love they had for each other. That was the true success. And I'm sorry, Jake continued, his voice breaking slightly as he let down the walls he had built around himself for so long. I'm sorry for all the times I wasn't there, for the times I was too caught up in my own grief to see what you needed. I'm sorry for not being the father you deserved earlier. But I promise you, I'll spend the rest of my life making up for that. Ethan reached across the table, his hand resting gently on Jake's. There's nothing to apologize for, Dad. We've both been through a lot, but we've learned, we've grown. We're okay. We're more than okay. Jake nodded, feeling the healing process complete in a way that was almost surreal. The pain of the past wasn't gone, it never would be, but it no longer had a hold on him. He had forgiven himself. He had let go of the guilt that had kept him bound for so long. And most importantly, he had learned that love, in its purest form, was about support, understanding, and unconditional care, not perfection. Healing and moving forward. As they sat there, the last rays of sunlight spilling over the horizon, Ethan and Jake shared stories of the past memories of Caroline, of their life before everything had changed. They spoke of the laughter, the challenges, the moments of joy, and the painful goodbyes. But even as they reminisced, there was no sadness. There was no lingering sorrow that clouded the air. Instead, there was a sense of acceptance, of peace. Jake had learned to let go of the past. He had stopped holding on to the what-ifs and could-have-beens that had once plagued him. He had come to understand that life was not about perfect resolutions, but about embracing the journey, no matter how imperfect or challenging it may have been. He was no longer the man he had been before, drowning in self-doubt and regret. He was stronger now, not just for himself, but for Ethan as well. Ethan, too, had found his own peace. He had faced his fears head-on, coming to terms with the loss of his mother and the pain that came with it. But he had also learned to forgive, not just Jake, but himself as well. He no longer viewed his life through the lens of grief. Instead, he embraced the future with hope, knowing that he could shape his own destiny, no matter the obstacles in his way. That night, as the two of them finished their dinner and cleaned up the table, a feeling of serenity washed over them. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from having everything figured out or being free from pain. It was the peace of acceptance, of knowing that they had done the best they could, that they had healed, and that they were no longer bound by the past. Later that evening, they sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting a warm light over their faces. Ethan looked at his father and smiled, a smile that spoke volumes. It wasn't just a smile of gratitude or joy, it was a smile of knowing that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, knowing that they had each other, and that was enough. Jake, feeling the weight of the moment, nodded in return. "We've made it, Ethan. We've come so far. And no matter what happens, I want you to remember something. You are everything I ever wanted in a son. I'm proud of you more than you'll ever know." Ethan's smile widened, and as the night stretched on, father and son sat side by side, no longer haunted by the ghosts of the past. They had healed, and in that healing, they had found something even more powerful, a love that was stronger than any obstacle, a bond that could never be broken. And that, Jake realized, was the true meaning of success. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit like and subscribe to Stories TH for more heartwarming stories. We appreciate your support.